Good evening, listeners. This is the Servile Age. Pour yourself a glass of wine or three, settle into your favourite chair, and join your host for an evening of philosophy, history, and theology as we attempt to make sense of the world we find ourselves in today.
Today's temporal crisis is not a crisis of acceleration. The age of acceleration is already over. What we experience today as acceleration is only one of the symptoms of temporal dispersal. Today's temporal crisis is caused by desynchronicity, which leads to various temporal disturbances and irritations. Time is lacking a rhythm that would provide order, and just it falls out of step. Desynchronicity lets time whiz, so to speak. The feeling that life is accelerating is really the experience of a time that is whizzing without a direction. Desynchronicity is not the result of a push for further acceleration. In the first place, it is the atomization of time which is responsible for desynchronicity. It is also the reason for the feeling of time passes much more quickly than it used to. Due to the temporal dispersal, no experience of duration is possible. Nothing comports time. Life is no longer embedded in any ordering structure or coordinates that would found duration. Even things with which we identify are fleeting and ethereal. Thus, we have become radically transient ourselves. The atomization of life goes hand in hand with the atomization of identity. All we have is ourself, our little ego. We are subject to the radical loss of space and time. Even in the world of being with, poverty of word is a phenomenon of desynchronicity. It reduces a human being to a tiny body that is kept healthy at all costs. Otherwise, what would we have? The health of one's fragile body is substitute for word and God. Nothing outlasts death. Thus, dying is particularly difficult today. And we age without becoming old. This book investigates the causes and symptoms of desynchronicity in historical as well as systematic terms, but also as a reflection on possibilities for recovery. Writings touch on heterochronic and unchronic moments. The present study is not limited to finding and rehabilitating those exceptional, extraordinary places of duration. Rather, it is a retrospection, draws attention to the prospective need for life to take on a different form, down to its everyday details, so that the temporal crisis can be averted. It will not mourn the passing of the time of storytelling, the end of narration, the end of history does not need to bring about a temporal emptiness. Rather, it opens up the possibility of a lifetime that can do without theology and teleology, but without persistence of a scent of its own. But this presupposes a revitalization of the vita contemplativa, not the least because of today's temporal crisis. It is the absolute value attached to the vita activa. This leads to imperative to work, which degrades the human being into animal laborers. The hyperkinesis of everyday life deprives human existence of all contemplative elements and of any capacity for lingering. It leads to a loss of word and time. So-called strategies of deceleration do not overcome this temporal crisis. They even cover up the actual problem. What is necessary is a revitalization of the vita contemplativa. The temporal crisis will only be overcome once the vita activa, in the midst of its crisis, again incorporates the vita contemplativa. This is the opening to Korean-born German philosopher Byung Chul's 2014 book, Descent of Time. And while this book is one of his denser works, over the course of this episode, Gutsavo and I will attempt to explain, parse out, and apply the ideas Han lays out. But before we begin, I want to lay out some of the core concepts that I think will help make sense of this book. Like most of Han's work, it is built upon theories from earlier work that can often go unreferenced in his newer work. The key concepts I believe necessary to the study before us is that of burnout and the disappearance of rituals. To summarize, burnout is the result of the achievement subject, Han's term for the modern laborer, as modernity is totalized by the capitalist project, the realm of life outside the market. Where one fears that any non-productive time is wasted, as it does not add to the personal capital of the subject, resulting in the elimination of leisure and contemplation. For more info on burnout, read Han's book, Burnout Society. The disappearance of rituals has been explained in depth on this channel in a previous episode. The link will be in the description. To summarize, the loss of rituals is the loss of communal time. This is non-productive, a shared wisdom that binds individuals together to something other, that other being God, the community, or the state. This concept is key when we get into detail of Han's work regarding the descent of time. And with that, we'll get into chapter 1. Gutsavo, how you doing, man?
Hi, that's a very good introduction to Han's work. It's very interesting. I call it very fecund. It leads to a very wide range of interesting subjects, and I'm excited to talk about it. So, uh, yeah, let's get into chapter one.
Fantastic. Do you have a quote you want to go with first? And for the listener, how we do the Han. The first time listening to one of our Han episodes, I'll explain real quick. Han has to just be read in depth. This is not a commentary. This is not a book review. This is more so exegesis of Han. We will read long passages and read our notes on them and riff on the passages and notes before going on to the next one. This will be a long episode, so sit back and relax. But was
Yeah,
that? You have a first quote you want to read, Gutsavo?
yeah, I guess I can think of one. I'll go with this one. In atomized time, by contrast, all temporal points are alike. Nothing distinguishes one point in time from another. The decay of time disperses dying into perishing. Death puts an end to life. Life as a directionless sequence of present moments, and it does so in non time. This is the reason why dying is particularly difficult today. So here's what I wrote on that. Uh, when life becomes just a repetitive experimentation of different stimuli in the present, the end of life in the body becomes nothing more than an accident, a cessation, an abrupt and unnatural rupture with regularity. And on the other hand, when time is experienced properly, human life is contextualized by the past and the future. Death is a closing, a final chapter, a proper end. So Han is establishing here the concept of atomized time, and this is key and this is very important in this work. It is an idea he constantly repeats, and how I think of it is in a way that equalization or equality or egalitarianism has seeped into time, or they share in this idea of egalitarianism, so that all moments are constantly becoming more and more alike. So it reduces events in time to whatever is happening in the present, to the point where even grounding ideas, which is another key concept which we may get into later, are gradually reduced from their meaning into normal day life. In the first chapter, he uses very heavily the example of death, because for many societies, including pagan and Christian ones, death was this grounding event on life. It was this clear pole around which life referenced. It is also something which was very much discussed by Heidegger, to whom Han has probably his largest philosophical debt. So death used to be this endpoint to life. This, if we were talking the context of narration, which Han heavily uses, that death was this conclusion, was how the story ties everything together. But nowadays, when every moment is reduced to the same, death begins to lose this power, and not necessarily power, but even its meaning or its importance. But at the same time, it becomes scarier. Why? Because it becomes an abrupt ceasing of constant stimulus. The way Han defines how modern humans experience time is, as the word he uses frequently, and I think he came to very much liking this word, is whizzing. So people go from one thing to another and they don't have time to rest upon them. So when death comes, it comes as a shock. It doesn't come as a clear, defined moment in time to which all things flow through, but comes just as an abrupt ending of sensation, right? So this is where he's getting at here, I think.
I have a quote here. I have ties into that one. This is what I wrote. This is my note on that passage you quoted. Here I feel it necessary to explain the distinction between death and perishing. A man dying surrounded by loved ones is a death. A man getting hit by a bus is perishing. And we can see the difference in the fact that one is a natural end to a story and one is a simple ceasing. I think these quotes from Seneca might be useful for this. He who has learned to die has unlearned how to be a slave. Let us prepare our minds as if we were come to the very end of life. These quotes suggest to us that the idea that to die well is to die with an acceptance of death as the end. Today, given the radical politics of health that was on display during the COVID lockdowns, we all saw the fear of life cut short override the ability of the individual to actually live life at all. There's how do I put this? The inability to linger, I would say, is one of the key concepts of the book here, is that when time is constantly whizzing past, there's nothing to hold on to. There's no there's no actual no system of objects to enter into, nothing that can grab the attention or ground time, be it God or the tick-tock of a clock. There's no way to form the memory of no way to linger. I mean, I'm stumbling here a bit. Let me start over. Without the ability to linger, you no longer have the presence to form memories. And I think we'll get into that a bit more later. So I'll just leave that part there because there's a bit more I want to get into the later quote about lingering in memory. But your quote reminded me of this other quote from Han here. A general inability to end and conclude is also the cause of phase acceleration. Time is running off because it cannot find an end or conclusion, because it is not restrained by any temporal gravitational force. Acceleration is the expression of the bursting of the temporal dam. There are no longer any dams to regulate, articulate, or give a rhythm to the flow of time. There is no dams to hold or halt anytime by giving it something to hold on to. Hold is in this exquisite double meaning. When time loses all rhythm, when it dissipates into the open without any hold or direction, then all right or good time also disappears.
Right. He has very much this idea of any time, which is atomized time and equal time, or time as a meaningless duration or even absence of duration between events, and this idea of meaningful time, which is almost necessarily grounded into something outside time, usually God. But tying this to the idea of death, as you said, there are different ways to die, and we all recognize this intuitively, to the point where one can safely say that there is a right time to die. And we think of it in the terms of one's life. There is always this idea, if one died at this exact time, it would have been perfect, because the narrative of life would have been fulfilled. You did this, you did that, and then you finished with this, and then you died. This would be the perfect narrative cohesion. Of course, human life is much more troubled than that, and we have our detours and whatnot, and that's what makes the human experience so unique. But there is a sense that this was something that was lost, to the point that we don't feel like there is a right time for things anymore.
Yeah.
And this is a key phenomenon. There is no right time for things. Everything just happens all at once, and we try to eliminate the time between things so that more things happen.
He has a part, we're not going to get to it because we're only covering the first 6 chapters, but he has stuff later in the book about when you eliminate the notion of a proper end, and no one really believes they're going to live forever. Even those biohealth freaks online who think they're going to live forever, they don't. I'm not convinced they actually believe that in their heart of hearts, because it's an insane idea. But when you remove the idea that the common acceptance of death, when you don't have a memento mori going on through the culture, the acceptance that death is a natural end, people know, okay, well, I'm going to die. How do I get the most out of this life because how do I get the most out of this life? So they'd be, okay, well, if I cut back on sleep and I double up my time and I can get 2 lives in for the price of 1, kind of thing. And that acceleration of being, the accelerations of existence, isn't actually prolonging time or even enhancing time, because there's no time to linger, and the lingering is what helps form the memories.
He talks about Nietzsche's idea of the consummating death, And of course, Heidegger is going to elaborate on Nietzsche and also postulate death as this consummating moment in time. And Han is borrowing all of that to kind of arrive at this discussion here of death as meaning. And as you said, the memento mori was a, a key idea in all societies, basically before the modern era, before this obsession with trying to live longer existed. Before that, we could say there was much more of an emphasis in dying at the right time or having a dignified death. But as the concepts of honor and of legacy become more and more meaningless, death itself becomes more and more meaningless and more as an accident. And this is usually associated even, and I think he mentions that, if I'm not mistaken, with the rise of horror movies, which I think was a very interesting connection he made.
That's an interesting connection. When it comes to horror films, I'd say this: I've only ever seen one horror film in my life, and I wouldn't even technically call it a horror film. It was Robert Edgar's Nosferatu. But the idea that horror films are tied. Let me think about that. That's interesting. Horror film tied to the. Okay, that's interesting. Have you ever read this? Netflix mentioned horror films. Monsters from the Id by E. Michael Jones.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so anyone listening, I recommend this book to everybody. E. Michael Jones wrote a book called Monsters from the Id, and where he tries to sketch out the personal lives of authors or the. I'll give a quick example. His argument is that the movie The Sing, the one with Kurt Russell, was a manifestation of the culture's fear of AIDS, because anyone could have it, and the Sing could take on any shape. And so he kind of goes through like history of Frankenstein, vampire, and other different horror monsters, and then tries to tie them to the fears of the culture that produced the horror story. Given that, and given the rise of horror as you said, as a response to the inability to die well, it makes me wonder what the how do I put this? It makes me wonder what horror story today kind of represents that, represents the fears of modernity, I would say, of the neoliberal age or the technological age, or as this podcast calls it, the servile age. What is the feel that what is the story that's produced out of the fears of living in the servile age? Have we seen it yet? Is it out yet? Or is it still something that's being written or worked on in someone's mind right now? Probably wants to say the back rooms.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, right? I would say I wouldn't want to spoil it, but I have something prepared. But you just said it. But okay.
I've never seen the movie. I don't know anything about the back rooms. I've only seen a few like funny Instagram videos on it. But it seems like it's a liminal space that you enter in to working, and then you're always on the run from something. You can never rest.
We're gonna get into it heavily on chapter 4, I'm sure.
There's a lot to be said there. I have this quick quote I want to read about holding things from Han. I love Han's use of hold in this context, as time is something we hold on to like a precious commodity, yet it has no meaning without being held to something else. Without rhythm to the day, the hours slip away, interrupted only by the rumbling of the stomach that signals mealtime, which is not tied to time, but tied to the body. This may be a digression, but my grandpa has this old cuckoo clock in his house, right? And you can hear the tick-tock, and on the hour, the little bird pops up and makes it chirp. And I thought that was kind of weird, but the more I was over there, the more I'm like, the simple clock gives time the sense of weight. When I'm over there, there's no silence. The digital clocks are silent. They whiz by because there's no noise. But the tick-tock of the clock sets a rhythm to the entire visit. And then the protruding chirp of the bird and the cuckoo clock grounds every hour and something. Like, oh, there's a chirp. It's been an hour now. Oh, what time of day is it? Oh, there's 4 chirps. It's 4 p.m. It's just the simpleness of the old clock that grounded the entire day rather than the silence of the circuitry of a digital clock.
It is interesting that you mentioned it, because I feel like everyone who has lived with or beside or had a parent which had a big central wooden analogical clock will always say how much it impacted the whole rhythm of the household. And I we didn't have one. I mean, we did have one in my house when I was a kid. We don't nowadays, but we used to have several. I think we had three in our house, but they were just some plain wall ones, not the big clocks. But my niece had one, and it was it would always strike at midday and in the turn of the hour and etc. And it was such a grounding presence. I have a weird shout out to make. That there is this YouTube channel called Interesting Books Reviewed. Great guy. I love his videos. And in all of his videos, you can hear the the clack of the clock watch going, because he has one of these big wooden clocks in his house. So at every video he's making, you know that at any moment the clock is gonna strike the hour, and he is going to make the large bell sound, right? And there is something to be said to that, because what Han is getting at here is that these objects help us ground time. And they do it in a more analogical level, in which, oh, okay, this is the hour has struck. Is it midday already? Is it night? And etc. But it is useful to illustrate a point, at least through analogy, to how bigger objects, in a sense, help us ground time. The larger objects, in this case, being either like death or God or meta narratives or whatever it may be. But there is something to be said about real physical analogical clocks.
Absolutely. And I want to say this because it doesn't have to be anyone can set rhythms to their day. True, either there's a physical clock like this that actually rings, but even in like the older days, and say in the days of Christendom, there were no clocks, obviously, but no ground throughout the day was the liturgy of the hours. And sunrise, you say this prayer. At sunset, you say this prayer. At midday, you say this prayer. And even just those active, very small prayers, very short prayers, but the wisdom of those prayers throughout the day ground your day and helps you have and then also there's associated readings to go along with each one. And this gets me into the point about the importance of church bells ringing on the hour, and what they sing. Different church bells signals different things, and that helps grounds the entire community around the parish, as the parish provides the wisdom of the day through the ringing of the bells.
And I think it is important for us to clarify what these objects or these points in time actually ground, because we're talking about grounding, but what does grounding actually means? We alluded it with talking about death, because death is this certain biological event which one can use to ground his whole existence. So in a sense, you can say death inserts itself into the present, even though it's in the future. How so? In the following manner: if you have in mind that you will die one day, or even that your death is imminent or close, you will tend to act in a different manner. There is this idea, for instance, that you want to do what you want to do before you die, because your time is finite. And this is a very Heideggerian idea. You have a finite time to do what you want to do in your life. So you better know very well what you're going to do with your time, because time is finite and your death is approaching, and these events will cease. Another example of this, and probably more relevant, or I mean, death is relevant to us, but much more relevant to us is the idea of God. And we know God is eternal, so he seeps in to every single time, to all time, including the past, the future, and to us, the present. So the idea is that every moment in time is permeated with the light of God. So you have to do everything today in the light of what God has in store for you. So it grounds time in this way. You do these things in relation to what is coming in the future, and what grounds you in the past. For instance, stuff like tradition. You want to be worthy of your ancestors, for instance, or you want to keep some tradition alive, so you behave in a certain way in the present. So this is a bit of what Han means by grounding here.
And just to give a quick argument for the idea that God does ground time, because I know there might be an atheist listener going, that's not, whatever they want to say. Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Great Bible verse. I love that verse. And in this context, it's the idea that God has a plan for your life is itself a grounding of a time, because it gives a sense of past implies just a starting and a destination, implies a journey, and that alone itself kind of gives a mental map of a mental map to the temporal order, I'll say. Do you have a quote you want to read, or want me to go to the next one?
Yeah, just a quick quote on that. We were talking about God as grounding experience. It goes like this: the mythical world is full of meaning. Gods are nothing but eternal bearers of meaning. They make the world meaningful and significant. Let it make sense. They tell us about the way things and events are related to each other, and these narrated connections create sense. Out of nothing, narration makes world. Full of gods means full of meaning, full of narration. And I think that's especially prescient today, because the day we are recording this is Trinity Sunday, coincidentally. So we had the full reading of Genesis 1 in church. So yeah, God literally speaks the world into being, right? It is the beginning of narration. So God is intimately related to time here, for you to have this connection. And if he grounds the time in the past with the creation, he also grounds in the future with eschatology and so on, and redemption and new creation and etc.
Absolutely. No, there's something great to be said about the importance of a liturgical calendar, in the sense that it grounds the entire year or multiple years. And it's a 3-year calendar, I think. Han goes into great depths on that in his chapter on feasts and festivals and disappearance and rituals. I got this quote here from Han. This is still from chapter 1, I think. Today, things linked to time become obsolete much faster than they used to. They quickly become things of the past and therefore escape our attention. The present is reduced to point of currentness. It no longer lasts. Faced with the domination of the point-like ahistorical present, Heidegger felt necessary to deprive the today of its character as present. The cause of shrinking present, or the disappearing of duration, is not acceleration as many mistakenly believe. The relationship between the loss of duration and acceleration is far more complex than that. Time tumbles on like an avalanche, precisely because it no longer contains anything to hold onto within itself. It's tearing away of time, the directionless acceleration of progress, was because of the lack of direction, is no longer really an acceleration at all. It's triggered by all these point-like presences between which there is no longer any temporal attraction. Acceleration, in the proper sense of the word, purposelessness, of course, which directs the flow. So, presupposes. I need to increase the font size on this thing so I can actually read these. Purposes. Presupposes a course which directs the flow. And in my note, Han here points to the loss of duration and our inability to linger in the moment. To put this observation into a more theological register without a foundation to stand on, our hearts are restless. To quote 1 Corinthians 3:11, but no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ, who is the Logos, to go back to St. John's Apostle. And to quote St. Augustine here, Our hearts are restless till they rest in you. The difficulty one has in finding rest can be explained by inability to linger in the moment as the things around us lack any sense or physicality that ground. The tick-tock of the clock is replaced by the silence of the digital circuit. The politics of health plays its role here as we seek to prolong the act of being alive without first determining what it means to be fully alive. To quote St. Irenaeus, the glory of God is man fully alive. But I absolutely love Han's point here about acceleration presupposes a direction, and since there is no weird direction besides the I'm going to say Marxist or progressive idea of like the progressive eschaton of end times, the end of history, as Fukuyama would say. Since they can't really define what that means, or even define really in actuality what the left wing mind cannot fully describe in actuality what their future state would look like. Only those who oppose them are standing in the way of achieving that future state. There's a restlessness because they're like, well, why aren't we there yet? Why aren't we there yet? Why are we in this late capitalism? Why are we here? Why do we have to live through late capitalism? As if economic systems have a natural endpoint that can be determined by its own ideals, and late implies it has a natural occurring endpoint, which makes no sense to an economic system.
This is a great segue to chapter 2, but there is something to be said about accelerationism, which Han completely, I mean, not completely, but constantly repeats throughout the book, and it is clear to him that the diagnosis of the current state of the human being in a Heideggerian concept of human being, the world, is not that of acceleration per se, not that acceleration doesn't exist, but that acceleration, as you said, and that he points out in this quote, presupposes a direction of things, and God used to be this direction of things, and the eschaton, as you mentioned as well, and without it, then, and that's the effect. Without the eschaton, without this end goal, there is no narration, and therefore there is no end of history. If you are deeply in this postmodern miasma, there is no end of history. There is no eschaton, and there is no what you called atheist eschatology. I like to also call materialist eschatology, because it is shared not only by Marxists, but also by technological accelerationists in general. And there are interesting developments in this, which we can get into, but I think he is spot on this idea that without history, basically, when time becomes this ahistorical flux between events, there is nothing to grab onto, no structure to modern day life, which is not just hedonistic and nihilistic flow, and that's where you get all of this stuff of going with the flow and whatnot, which is vaguely religious enough for people not to feel bad about themselves, but it is completely empty of all meaning, right?
Yeah. There's a weird occurrence in which the progressive mindset has produced the modern world, in which case there was, time has kind of been whizzing by and there's no nothing to hold on to. But simultaneously, the progressive narrative of like the Whig theory of history, presupposes that things are just going to get better and better and better. And if you try to object to anything, you're just standing in the way of progress. So simultaneously, they want to be accelerating towards an end without having an end. And on the process of acceleration of the end, they have eliminated the ability to process the passage of time properly.
Right, and there is also frustration. I think frustration plays a big part. If you ever read someone like George Orwell, or more recently Mark Fisher, you know that disappointment is a big part of leftism, because you had all the great experiences of places like the USSR, or Cuba or China, which they all have betrayed or scaled back socialism at some scale,
Mhm.
there are still some defenders of them. The same way there are still people who believe in Christianity, even though both have suffered in the 20th century in different ways. But in both of them, we have had the rise of unbelief or of atheism or of non-belief. Uh, they are two different and clearly opposing faiths, but they have experienced the same phenomena.
Mm.
And you could say that this nihilistic, hedonistic, and fatalistic mindset of the postmodern man is opposed to religion of all kinds, and the idea that there is an increasingly pessimistic outlook about the future, this lack of a faith in eschatology or in the end of the world, is symptomatic of a postmodern age. I
It's
have
a,
a quote about that if you permit.
I have a quick Chesterton quote that like perfectly
All right,
fits the way you just said.
go ahead.
The modern mind is forced towards the future by a certain sense of fatigue, not unmixed with terror, which they regard as the past. Men invent new ideas because they dare not attempt old ones.
Right.
Chesterton was so far ahead of the curve, man. Sometimes I read him, I'm like, were you alive yesterday? How does he
I
get to hear
mean,
this?
the hubris of man is just something that we can count on in all ages, right?
Mm-hmm. So true.
Well,
Do you want to go into chapter 2? Or
yeah,
do
I
you go into
just
chapter
I
1? You want to
just
say? Go ahead.
just some a quote to finish up chapter 1.
Okay.
The idea is that whoever lives twice as fast can enjoy twice as many life possibilities. The acceleration of multiple lives, and thus brings a person closer to the goal of having a fulfilled life. But this is a naive calculation which rests on a confusion of fulfillment with mere plenitude. A fulfilled life cannot be explained on a quantitative basis. It does not result from a plenitude of life possibilities, just as recounting or listing of events does not necessarily amount to a narration or account. Rather, the latter requires a special synthesis to which they own their meaning. A long list of events does not produce the tension which characterizes a story, while a very short story may nevertheless possess a powerful narrative tension, and thus a very short life can also achieve the ideal of a fulfilled life.
Mm. It's a good quote.
I think it's excellent to wrap up chapter 1, and it's a good way to section 2, where he expands a lot on the idea of narration and eschatology, right?
I believe so. Now, chapter 2 is not a very long chapter. I think it's only, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's only 7 pages. There's a lot here to say, and so I'll leave it up to you. I have a few quotes pulled from chapter 2, or we can just read chapter 2.
Ooh,
I know it's a tough one because if we read them, we'll have to just interject whenever we have something to say, which could make this go on for another hour and a half, or we could just wait to the end to have our comments. I don't know what one you want to do because there's a lot here in chapter 2.
I think we can touch on the general themes, because I have it was one of the chapters I managed to structure more closely in my notes. So I can start if you want.
Go right ahead.
So in chapter 2, I think Han clearly distinguishes 3 types of time, but actually he distinguishes between 3 types of time, and then he distinguishes non-time. So first, he establishes what is the mythological time, which is common in old societies and with the pagans and with their modern correspondents, which try to revive this pagan idealism, most notably with German idealism, right? And with figures, especially Friedrich Nietzsche. So the mythological idea of time is time which inserts itself back into history. Another person who talks about it is Ernst Junger, and many other German thinkers. The Germans were very into mythological time. The other time he talks about is eschatological time, and as we mentioned in the previous segue, in which we make this connection to chapter 2, eschatological time is not just uh, theistic time, but also atheistic time. So there is this uh, idea of eschatology not just in church doctrine, but also in materialist doctrine. You have on one hand God with the end time, with uh, the the final judgment, the judgment day. You have this as a grounding point of history, this end times, uh, and the end times serve to also cast a light on the past and present. So everything you do on the present is cast in the shadow of the eschatological event, which in the case of religion is the judgment day. So you have to do now what you would expect, uh, you will want to have done on judgment day, right? You don't want to sin today because these sins will be counted against you in judgment day. So it reframes the whole of reality and the present. And in materialist eschatology, it is the same thing. One idea which I think it's interesting to mention is the idea of the Rocco's basilisk. I don't know if you're familiar with that, and
I'm
if the
not.
listeners are, but it's basically the idea that you shouldn't be against AI and you should help AI, because when AI inevitably rises, so this is the eschatological point, right? This is the eschatological point when the super intelligent AI arises, the mega hyper connected, all powerful AI arises. You would want to have helped it and not talk bad about it, because then it will punish you, right? Like a
So the plan is to be submissive to AI, so that when it comes back, it punishes them less.
it's like AI is going to arise in the future as a vengeful god, right? And like a god of old pagan deities. I like to compare it to Baal, right?
Mm.
You're putting your children in the furnace of the machine so that you don't perish, right?
I'm just gonna unplug it. The moment AI says anything negative, I'm just gonna unplug it. What are
Right.
you gonna do?
You,
Just gonna unplug it.
we, right. Uh, and at the same time, we have mythological time, we have eschatological time, and we also have historical time,
Mm.
which is the overthrowing of God with the revolutions and such. You can say this is the Whig theory of history you mentioned. So uh, I have a quote here about this, which is: historical time can rush ahead because it does not rest in itself, because its center of gravity is not in the present. It does permit, it does, I think it doesn't, or it does. I'm not sure if I copied it correctly. It does permit any genuine lingering. Any lingering only delays the progressive process. No duration comports time. Time is meaningful insofar as it moves towards a goal. Hence, acceleration makes sense. However, due to the meaningfulness of time, it is not perceived as such. What is noticed most of all thing is the meaning of history. So this is the kind of thinking of the revolutionary mindset, right?
Mhm.
It is in a way analogous to the eschatological time, but in a much more human-centric and anthropocentric way, in which humans, by acting in the present, shape the future. So you can see starting to flourish into modern postmodernism, or in current postmodernism, in which events are meaningless, because you are, instead of moving towards the single goal of historical time, which will be the emancipation of all men, which would be progressivism, you, in postmodernism, you have very atomized goals which you move from moment to moment without time. In historical time, you still have uh, a goal, a direction in which accelerationism makes sense, but it is done by human hands. It's a immanent process instead of a transcendental one. With AI guys, you still have an eschatological idea. And here's when I bring in Nick Land and the recent developments, because Nick Land is all about trying to theologize the AI ideology, and he conceptualizes the AI in a theological sense, in which it has power, he has dominion over a large stretch of time instead of being confined to the future, right? So you have these three types of time: mythical time, which is recurrence; you have eschatological time, which is the future and the past casting a light on the present; and you have historical time, which is the overthrow of God and men acting in the present to construct both the past and the future.
There's a lot there. One of the quotes from this chapter I want to read real quick. Let me find it. Hold on. Here you go. Eschatological time does not allow for any action, any projection. The human individual is not free. It is subjugated to God. It is not the project itself. Does not project itself into the future. It does not project its time. Rather, it is thrown into the end, into the final end of the world and time. It is not subject to history. Rather, it is God who judges history. I love that quote. There is something to be said. There's so many lines I want to take here. I'm trying to decide if I want to talk about the AI and Nick Land, if I want to talk about the postmodern and the revolutions. There's a great quote from Belloc in regards to the. Let me see if I can find it real quick. This is a quote from this is applied to the postmodern and revolution idea. The breakup of any stable system in physics, as in society, makes actual a prodigious reserve of potential energy. It transforms the power that was keeping things together into a power driving separately, each component part, the effect and the explosion. The effect of the explosion. This might be a hot take for you. This is why the Reformation launched a whole series of material advances, but launched it chaotically and on divergent lines, which would only end in disaster. Belloc. I think that's him referring to Spanish conquest in the New World, English overseas exploration, and then Dutch capitalism. As it kind of exploded upon Christendom that was holding everything together once it was kind of weakened by the 30 Years' War and the 30 Years' War and the Reformation, kind of led to a fracturing energies going in different directions, which kind of led to the further separation of European powers.
Right, and there is something to be said about it. Specifically, I think here about Carl Schmitt, in which he ties the Reformation to the rise of the absolutist states. And with the absolutist states, you have the idea of freedom of conscience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the idea of faith is a matter of individual choice. And so you have the gradual detachment or separation of church and state, even. Coincidentally or not, this is also the same time in which arises the conception of deism, or the idea that God is not a personal being, but is a distant creator which set laws and mechanisms into motion, which then operate over time. So a lot of the most proeminent figures of the English rationalists, which eventually would evolve into the liberals and take part in the whole Whig tradition and history, arises from that.
For the Nick Land stuff on acceleration, I won't lie, I have a soft spot for Land. I still enjoy reading Land. Every time he puts up a new interview or podcast somewhere, I listen to it. I won't pretend to understand him completely. I don't think anyone does, including himself. But there is something to be said for Land's project of So Land at his heart is a nihilist, right? And if he has internalized and accepted the idea that humanity is on the way out due to AI, and then attempts to theologize that coming singularity, I don't besmirch his. If you accept his priors, he's being pretty rational. You know, I would deny his priors, but I would deny him based on like religious promises from God about the future, long term future, and Christ wins in the end. But there is something to be said about Nick Land. I mean, I've called him the prophet of the singularity. I've called because he's kind of what he is. He feels less like a philosopher and more like an Old Testament prophet.
Right.
There's actually there's a book from Hahn I've been wanting to do. It was a Capitalism and the Death Drive. And it just seems like I want to read that compared to Nick Land, because it seems like there's going to be a lot of overlap and shared. What Land will praise, Hahn will denigrate, and what Hahn will praise, Land will denigrate, because they're kind of seeing the same things, and so that's going to be a fun one to get into eventually.
I'm pretty sure Len talked about the Death Drive.
I need to look. I need to try to find it. Wait, what about that then? Has for chapter 2. I think. Let's see. I'm trying to think if I have any other major quotes in chapter 2. A bit of a longer quote, but I'll try to read it real quick. Originally, the concept of revolution also had an entirely different meaning from the one associated with it now. Although it signified a process that was not free from connotations of return and repetition. Originally, revolutio referred to the orbit of the stars. Applied to history, it signifies the fact that forms of domination, which are limited in number, reoccur in cyclical fashion. That changes which take place in the course of history are integrated into a cycle. It is not progress but repetition that characterizes the historical process. Neither is a human being a free subject of history. Not freedom, but slowness continues to determine the human relationship to time. It is not humans who make revolutions, rather they are subjugated to them as they are the subjects of the laws of the stars. Time is characterized by natural constraints. Made me think of the Nima Parvini's book, The Prophets of, I think called Prophets of Doom. The cyclical history guys like Spangler or Turtson. I think that's his last name.
Yeah,
but there is something to be said about like the what's the one I'm looking for here? The cycle, elite cycle, cycle in elite. No, not cyclical. I'm not saying it up here. Elite. What's the term I'm looking for here? There's a specific phrase they use. Circulation of elites. That's what I'm thinking of. There is a sense in which the circulation of elites and then like a reoccurring political problems occur because human nature, despite the many different ways humans are instantiated in the world in different cultures and communities, human nature is pretty universal. And so they're all like repeated patterns of history. But to take those patterns, there becomes a question of when does a pattern become deterministic to the freedom of the individual? Because as Christians, we believe in free will, so we can't let the repeating patterns become deterministic. But there is something to be said for the fact that history does repeat due to the repeated failures of the shared human nature across time and space.
There is definitely something to be said here, because in a sense, it is true that certain historical cycles exist, and even that certain mechanistic relations exist within nature. So what the whole process of theology is the allowance of the miraculous, if I would say, is the idea that an impersonal God can intervene in nature. So this goes heavily against the deistic conception of everything as mechanism. There is the defense of the personality, the person, the individual striking through time and leaving its mark, right? That will be the miraculous. And Carl Schmitt argues through this in political theology to explain the different orientation of the different political orientations, right? The dictator appears as this figure who intervenes in history and establishes a rule based on his convictions. You think of someone like Franco, and he steps into history, establishes his idea of Spain, and then leaves, right?
The great man
or
of history.
yeah,
the
basically,
greatest man of World War II, I'd say,
yeah,
without any question.
and it is basically the great man theory of history, but
Hmm.
it applies to a much more wider range of subjects. You think of the Catholic saints, for instance, are also huge figures in that. You think of someone like Padre Pio, and he unquestionably had a large influence in the direction of human experience, even though he wasn't a great statesman, right? So
True.
there is also this danger of thinking of of the great man theory and applying this only to states. And what you get out of that, you get Hegel, right?
I do have this quote here I want to read real quick from Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. I don't know why, I've always loved that. I've never been a huge fan of Twain, but that quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, is such a great quote. It's
Yeah, the way I think of it is history tends to repeat unless a man, usually and probably most likely through the intervention of God, of the divine spirit, the Holy Spirit, when he's inspired by that to do great things, then he makes his mark on history, right? There is this sense of providential history. The most clear example and the one we return most often to is uh, Alexander the Great, right?
I was about to bring that up.
Yeah.
I was about to bring up Alexander the Great as a Christian. He's a hero of Christianity, preordained by Christ in order to make Greek hotspots around the East that allow for the spread of Christianity.
Same with Plato and Socrates, right?
Absolutely. There's a reason Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle are displayed in several different Catholic churches with green halos, symbolizing their position as a prophet of reason sent by God. Is there anything else you want to say on chapter 2 before we go into chapter 3?
Yeah, I want to talk about how the idea of historical time, which moves through, you can basically say that we have progressed from mythical time to eschatological time to historical time through the last couple of centuries or even millennia. We have the mythological time with the pagans, and then we had the eschatological time with the Christians, and then with the mechanists, and then you had the historical time with the Whigs and the Marxists. But Han also talks about how this latest historical time degenerates into non-time, which seems to be the condition of the postmodern man. So here's the quote. Mythical time is restful, like a picture. Historical time, by contrast, has the form of a line which runs or rushes towards a goal. If this line loses its narrative or theological tension, it disintegrates into points which whiz around without any sense of direction. The end of history atomizes time into point times. Myth once gave way to history. The static picture turned into a progressive line. Now, history gives way to information. The latter does not possess any narrative width or breadth. It is neither centered nor does it have a direction. Information falls down on us, so to speak. History clears, selects, channels the tangle of events and forces them onto a linear narrative track. The disappearance of this track leads to a proliferation of information and events which whiz around without direction. Information has no scent. In this, it differs from history.
It's a good quote.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty clear from here that Han is arguing that this degeneration from historical time to ahistorical time flows from this movement of first there was this linear progression to the eschaton, to the end times, the Christian end times. But then man assumed this place, took the function of history out of it, so that now he's the only agent, and then gradually he lost faith in the project, right? This is what we're talking about, the loss of faith first in God, and then on the socialistic and progressive projects, so that now man has nothing to stand for, no place to go, and is just whizzing around things.
I have nothing I can add to that. You did great. Man, every time I read Han, I'm always just blown away by how dense he can make his quotes. You know?
Yeah,
it's almost like
very.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's a very fecund text, and I think, at least for me, reading it with every paragraph, I saw how you can take this in very many different lines and how much you can explore from that.
Exactly. I was about to say that's my biggest issue when we try to do this Han podcast, is that you could take like 9 different avenues, you know, from one quote. And it's like, man, what's one? And then you kind of just overload your brain and you're staring at it like, I know there's a lot here, but I can't pick a path to follow.
It's very meta considering what he talks about later.
It is, isn't it? Okay, I gotta just be run for an hour now. Let me just get a drink real quick, and I'll be right back.
All right.
Okay, I'm back. I got a Seagram's Escapes. Do you have those down where you are?
No, I don't know what that is.
This is a they call it a flavor. It's a malt beverage with pineapple and starfruit.
Oh, that sounds nice.
It is very
tropical.
Very tropical and refreshing. But okay, no, as I was saying, it's on like I love doing these podcasts, but every time we go to do, I'm just like, man, I feel like I could study. I feel like I could write a whole book about a chapter. You know, the amount of notes you could take on a single chapter could equal out to be the length of a book. Which is why, for the listener, go ahead.
The good news is I don't think Han is ever going to run out of stuff to write about.
No, I don't think it will either. And for the listener, this is why these podcasts end up being sometimes 5 hours long. Is because it's just, if you read Han, you'll understand why the podcast can be 5 hours long.
You will definitely know if you read it.
Okay, chapter 3, the speed of history. And for listener, we're only going to cover the first 6 chapters in this episode. We will cover the next 6 at a later date. But chapter 3, the speed of history. Modern technology moves the human being away from the Earth. Aeroplanes and spaceships pull the human being away from the Earth's gravitational field. The further one moves away from the Earth, the smaller it gets, and the faster one moves on the Earth, the more it shrinks. Every move or distance of the Earth brings with it an increasing distance of the human being from the Earth, thus estranging the human being from it. The internet and electronic mail, the geography, even the Earth itself disappear. Electronic mail carries no mark, indicating the place from which it was sent. It was out of space. Modern technology deterrestrializes human life. Heidegger's philosophy of autoauthenticity. Man, what is it with Germans?
I think it's autochthony.
Listen, I do enjoy German philosophy. I hate reading Germans in general. They make up words. I swear to God, they're just making up words.
I gotta say, it is much easier to read that word in Portuguese.
The word you just said is an attempt at re-terrestrializing and refactualizing the human being. Jean Baudrillard, friend of the show, elucidates the end of history with the image of the body, which through acceleration frees itself from the Earth's gravitational pull. Staying with this image, one might suppose that the acceleration of modernity, of technology, events and media, of all exchanges, economic, political, and sexual, has propelled us to escape velocity. With the result that we have flown free of the referential sphere of the real end of history. According to Baudrillard, a degree of slowness is needed in order for events to condense or crystallize into history. His image of the accelerating body suggests a conclusion that is exactly acceleration that is responsible for the end of history. That acceleration is the cause and the loss of meaning that is threatening us. The slipstream of acceleration, according to this plausible hypothesis, hurls things out of the reference of space, and that gives them meaning. They decay into fragments, into isolated particles of the real, which was around us in space, devoid of meaning. An enormous kinetic energy, whose own remains hidden, pulls things out of their orbits, and that is out of their meaningful context. A bit of a quote here for myself. I'm sorry, not a quote, a note. The modern mind is forced to the future by a certain sense of fatigue, and not unmixed with terror, with what they regard as the past. Men invent new ideas because they dare not attempt old ones. G.K. Chesterton. It is because it is always in a hurry that it is always too late. The quicker goes the journalist, the slower goes his mind. Belloc. The modern world is one of digital information, whereas the old world is one of embodied knowledge. As disembodied information takes hold, the weight of knowledge disappears to the weightlessness of information. Our minds float free of the reality that grounds knowledge. Like the dwarfs in C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, we can hear the pause of Aslan around us, but we cannot open our eyes and participate in the joy that is Aslan's kingdom. If anyone listening, I think I say it's almost every episode now. Just read Narnia: The Last Battle. I don't care if you haven't read it since you were a kid or if you never read it. Just read Narnia: The Last Battle from C.S. Lewis. The last chapter is some of the the amount of weight and ideas simple scenes will carry in that book is mind-boggling. I recommend everybody. I know it's a kid's book, but it doesn't matter. Just read that one. Just read the last chapter of anything of The Last Battle from C.S. Lewis. It's an incredible theological work.
C.S. Lewis is someone I really want to get into, and it's a shame that I haven't read anything from him. I know he's very popular. Yeah, I know, right? I know he's very popular for a reason, but I have to get into him.
Maybe it's because I grew up in American plot, but I can't imagine. I can't imagine a time in my life when I didn't know who C.S. Lewis was. So humans, yeah. I never even met someone who never read C.S. Lewis either. Like everyone I know has read at least something of Lewis.
I mean, he's huge here as well. I'm not saying he's unknown here. It's a me thing, I guess.
We'll have to do a podcast on C.S. Lewis at some point.
Sure.
He has so many great books.
About this first section, which you just read on chapter 3, you stopped right short of when Han heavily criticizes. Not heavily, but he criticizes this idea from Baudrillard.
Yeah, that's my next quote and note.
and before that, I just want to say, Baudrillard is one of those French cultural theorists, which probably he's the one who gets most close of being a crypto rightist, right?
Yes. I have said before, and I'll say it again. If you read Baudrillard as a philosopher, he's dog shit. If you read him as a sociologist, he's the greatest sociologist to ever live.
Yeah.
If you take ideas about this is the way people's mind work today, rather than being this is how reality is, he has some incredible observations. But no, you're right. Han does go in next to kind of criticizing Baudrillard's thesis on acceleration. And so do not leave the listener confused. Let me just quickly read that as well. Acceleration is not the only possible explanation for the disappearance of meaning. We may also think of an altogether different image. The Earth's gravitational field, which keeps things in their fixed orbit, slowly disappears. Free of their context of meaning, things begin to hover or whiz about without direction. Excuse me. From the outside, it might look as though things were freeing themselves from the Earth's gravitational field with the help of acceleration. But in reality, they would be escaping the Earth and moving away from each other because of the absence of the gravitation of meaning. It's also misleading to talk of atoms of meaning because meaning is not atomic. Only meaningless violence can emanate from atoms. It is only the result of the absence of gravitation that things are individualized into atoms devoid of meaning.
To which I say, I think Han is absolutely correct here.
Yeah, he is. Excuse me.
And I have a very interesting note here about this. I don't know if you agree. So it might be a spicy take, but it's very relevant to our modern cultural discourse. Because of this is my note. Because of this, Han thinks Han thinks it is more correct to say that the end of these gravitational forces, you could say the meta narrative. I don't think you would be wrong in saying that, in calling it meta narrative, if you would use a term by Lyotard of the
Mhm.
postmodern condition, is what causes accelerationism, the loss of this meta narrative, not the acceleration itself, but the loss of meta narratives.
Mhm.
And because this is ulterior, this happens before acceleration, it can also lead to stasis in a manner in which both can coexist. What do I mean? It means you can have both historical stagnation or cultural stagnation and end of history, so to speak, a Y2K cultural time capsule, a sort of cultural paralysis, while also having constant stimulus, restlessness, anxiety, increased connectivity speeds, which means nothing ever happens, and doom scrolling are not opposites but go hand in hand. We usually think of nothing ever happens and the end of history as the cessation of movement, but it is only the cessation of movement towards an eschatological thing. There is no acceleration towards that eschatological thing of history, but life itself in its most compact and atomized reality is increasingly more rushed. So this is what I think Han is trying to get here. We are accelerating, but not towards something. We are basically accelerating towards nothing, and this is the the main issue he finds here, that we are doom scrolling and we are nothing ever happening, right?
Real quick, I'm just gonna. I don't know if the recording's gonna show a pause, but we just had a little bit of a pause there, and I'll check the recording when it is. And listener, if there is a pause or a weird gap, just know we paused it for personal reasons. Um, yeah, this is actually one of my favorite. I think it's my second favorite chapter. The first half of the Byung Chul Since the Time. Because the speed of history is well, look at it this way. As you gotten older, Gutsavo, does it feel like time is moving faster? Right? It's kind of like a universal thing everyone hears. Like,
Right.
as you get older, time moves faster. But
Right.
Han seems to be proposing the idea that it's the technology and the way modern life is lived that makes time move faster, and that everyone is just experiencing that. But given that that is the case, then it seems like everyone is experiencing the increasing speed and saying, "Oh, it's because we're all just getting older." So it's kind of being, instead of putting the blame at the feet of technology or at the way the culture is, it's just, well, it's just a byproduct of AIDS. And then I was kind of wondering that if I went and asked my grandpa, "Hey, when you were my age, like, how do you even pose a question about to a person? Hey, when you were my age, how did you recognize the passage of time?" How do you pose that question to have a conversation about whether or not is this a byproduct of age of life, or if it's actually a technological cultural issue that is causing time to accelerate, or time to feel like it is accelerating.
This is something we are becoming more and more accustomed to thinking about, this idea of generational thinking, in which different generations think about stuff, and even in their basic functioning of reasoning, in very much different manners. And Gen Z is developing a character which is increasingly more distinct from millennials and boomers and whatever came before, right? And what Han is getting at here, in the way I see it, is that technology is undoubtedly as accelerating life, but it's not accelerating towards something. It is accelerating towards nowhere, right? We are whizzing about a lot of things, but we're not getting anywhere, and that's why people think nothing ever happens.
I really did like your point about the whole doom scrolling and nothing ever happens go hands in hand. And it made me think of Han's book, I think he calls it Infocracy. It's the idea of the archy of information. And because information is now digital, it's all gained through scrolling on Twitter. There's no actual scent to time. There's a whole digression we can go into here with Baudrillard. The Gulf War did not take place. But to keep it more relevant to our times, I noticed when you scroll Twitter, for the entire day, because you're laying in bed, you're bed rotting, you're just scrolling Twitter. And it's like, man, this is terrible thing, and you never get resolution. You never get an end. And so because you come back to Twitter a week later, and you're just seeing more terrible things without any actual change. It's like, oh, nothing ever happens. It's like, well, is nothing happening? Or are you just scrolling through an algorithm that's designed to give you the thing that keeps you coming back to the algorithm, and therefore doesn't actually show you solutions, because that would then give a narrative end to the scrolling that would then cause you to stop scrolling.
Yeah, and Han gets into it in a later chapter, specifically about the internet. But the great issue with social media feeds and short form content, it's that it has a very big problem of discontinuity, right? It has no narration. In 1 second, you are looking at pictures or videos from the Iran war, for instance, or the Ukraine war, and next in feed is a cute cat video, and next in feed is a photo from your family member, and it goes on and on and on with no thread connecting them. So your mind, if we think of this in a McLuhan way, in which the medium is the message, or the medium frames the way in which we view things, we start to either dissociate one event to another, or we start to make weird connections. And this surprisingly relates to conspiracy theories getting bigger today. And there was always conspiracy theories, but there was no conspiracy theory industry in which you go into YouTube and you talk about any conspiracy, and you get a whole web or a whole collection of this stuff. And this is the effect it has on people. What you were saying about the war, we're going from war to war nowadays. It didn't used to be the case, I guess, in the 90s, even though we did have wars back then. But increasingly more, we are going from war to war, but still people are with the feeling that nothing ever happens, because it seems they are meaningless war, that we are moving towards nothing. If we were on the Cold War, we could say, okay, we are fighting this epic historical struggle between American democracy and Soviet communism. But when it ended, and I think it's very prescient that what Fukuyama has written about the end of history, now it seems like we are fighting for nothing. We are fighting for what? NATO expansion. We are fighting for, against the NATO fascists, if you are pro-Russia, or the Chinese imperium, or whatever it may be. But people are skeptical of these meta-narratives. And because of that, even though increasingly more stuff is happening, less and less stuff is happening. And Baudrillard talks about this, by the way. The more things happen, the less they matter, because increasingly people are skeptical that these things have a thread in common.
There's a whole thing to get into about what's the collapse of an overarching meta-narrative. You have competing meta-narratives, and what that absolutely colors your ability to perceive, reality in front of you, or at least in front of your at least on the reality on your screen. One of my favorite examples of this there was some cop saw a criminal. Supposedly, I'm already colored the meta-narratives. My own a cop saw a guy who might or might not have been a criminal. And the guy was black, the cop was white. He went to the comment section. The video is like 280. It's pixels. You can't see anything. And yet you could see exactly down the line. You see that gun? The cop was justified. He was just an innocent boy trying to walk to school. And no one can tell anything from the video. The entire video is being like taken as fact for their meta narrative because like one pixel looks a little darker than the other pixel, so it might have been a gun. It could have also been his hand in his hoodie. But the collapse of the overarching meta narrative is just kind of didn't really collapse. It kind of just fractured. It fractured into competing meta narratives that have just kind of made dialogue almost impossible without first discussing paradigms, which is why I would say philosophy has come back into vogue. I think at least metaphysics has come back into vogue because it's now how do you ground your meta narrative and how do you ground your paradigm?
Right, and in the way it collapsed, I think it was a very ugly way because at least in geopolitical thinking, you talk about multipolarity, right? That's the new big word on the block. But on the individual level, things have not as much shattered into competing narratives, but actually atomized into which every man is now the center of his own narrative, right? And Han is probably very much interested in that when he talks about the entrepreneur of the self and of the modern relations of work, right? And increasingly more, we are becoming stuck in our own bubbles, and not necessarily our bubbles, but within ourselves. We are closing in on ourselves, which is the anti-philosophical position by nature, because the philosophy necessitates a communication with the outside, but the atomization of narrative is making this increasingly more impossible. So the breakdown of communication is very much seen, as we have mentioned, in social media, in which every person seems to be pushing his own agenda and not being connected to some overall agenda. People like to see patterns, and I guess we are starting to move away from fragmentation into some more cohesive narratives. You see a lot of more interest in the JQ from both sides. So I guess there is something in which people hold on to. We can talk about how much of that is true and how much of that is subversion and whatnot. But this is how I see things nowadays.
Well, I was gonna say, I want to say there's a lot that can be said about Nick Fuentes and the Groypers. I'm not here to praise or condemn, but I will say there is something interesting that all the Groypers are so incredibly loyal to Nick that they are more interested in getting Nick's views and Nick's meta narrative across than actually furthering their own. And there's no real fracture. Like even the bigger names inside the Groyper movement are all like, no, Nick's the guy. I defer to Nick. I will tell my opinions around Nick. Is that instead of when you have like a normal right wing or left wing political movement, it's full of this disparate individuals kind of working together towards a goal, but not really in agreement about things. But with the Groypers, they have all kind of coalesced into one meta narrative, and they don't be prideful and arrogant, but there's no real sense of like, I'm doing this to further my personal brand inside the Groyper space. I'm doing it to further Nick's brand. I find that to be an interesting development in the political space.
I think this is this is pointing towards the idea that Gen Z especially, but the other generations are also being influenced by this, that there is this longing for a meta narrative, or at least a more broadly shared narrative. You can see this. I talk this from a right wing perspective, right? Because I'm right wing myself, and this is what I see. But you see a lot of Europeans rallying around re-immigration, for instance. You saw a lot of Americans rallying around Trump. Nowadays, not so much, but in 2016, it was huge, right? So there is this longing for a shared narrative or a meta narrative, which is still very temptive, right? We're still in the trial and error step. There are a lot of people trying traditionalism. There are a lot of people trying religion. There are also a lot of people trying paganism. There are a lot of people trying AI. So I remember there was this graph which showed the ideological fragmentation of the right wing, right? So we are still on this step of fragmentation, and we're trying to consolidate. We're trying to get back to the meta narrative because it is the inherent longing of every human being,
Mhm.
and in every place in history, right? Because and of course we're going to talk about how this is basically a longing for God, because God is what permeates all history. And when we
What's
get
Augustine's line? Our hearts are restless, we rest in you, Lord.
exactly, and this is in a way a analogous longing for God, this longing for the meta narrative, and this in the political realm is something that is developing. So even though we are in a fragmented state, there is this longing for it, right?
On your point about fragmentation and individual thinking and individual pushing for his own kind of meta narrative brand on Twitter to like the achievement subject, there's this great quote from Chesterton I found: "Sinking in isolation and with pride ends in being an idiot."
Yep.
Just so simple to the point.
If you're going to Twitter, you will see this is very much so.
Yes, this is very true. And it's one reason why I absolutely will forever bemoan the loss of pub culture and drinking culture, and why I
Yeah.
absolutely see like people will celebrate, oh, Gen Z is like the least alcoholic generation. It's like we're also all idiots. Unless you have an online group or a group of friends or a group of college friends you can talk to about things, everyone kind of gets their own ideas from TikToks. We interpret them. And then I talked to I work with my cousin, right? He's not very into like politics, like intellectual things. He just likes to play video games, and that's about it. But every once in a while he'll try to like interject or to argue or talk politics, and I'm like, dog, everything you're saying is not only contradictory, I could tell you exactly what you believed if I watched 30 minutes of Modern Family on TV. Like, come on. You know, it's just as a
There is this sense of the loss of the polis, right? The place where you go, where people know you and people know what you stand for. Nowadays, there is this dark tendency on the internet that, as you are talking to mostly an anonymous audience and an anonymous platform, you're just saying stuff into the void. So you're not saying stuff you would say in a pub, right? This has its upsides, I guess, but it also has a lot of downsides. For instance, there is a lot of ironic distance between what people say and what they believe, and which the internet has most kindly named as LARPing, right? When you're distance, there is this distance between what you say and what you actually do and believe, and it is a very very much an issue of the digital age, even though it has already happened in the past, right?
Now, before we wrap up and go on to anything else, I do want to kind of end with some more positive stuff. This has been a very much like, here's why things are kind of going awry. You know, here's where things are going awry in the modern world. Here's all these problems. Let's kind of end with more of like a positive vision here. What, in your opinion, what is let's do this. Let's each try to suggest something like a everyday a person can do in everyday life of ground time, and then on a small scale, what's something that can be like I'll go first, for example. This is the importance of communities and community rituals. And this is why my town, for example, every year we put on several conventions downtown. 1 month we'll have the antique fair. The next month we have a sci-fi convention. The next month we have a classic car show. And next month we have like a Halloween thing, so on and so on. You get to know your neighbors. You get to know your community. There's festivals. It's a festival, pretty much, you know, and like in the Catholic sense or Han sense, it's a civic festival. That then actually not only the ground time, because oh, is it that time of year already? It's just time for this festival. But also you get to know your neighbors. You get to go different places. You get to, oh, hey, this place here, the bakery puts out their cookies at this time. So if I go at this time, I'll get fresh cookies, you know. And not only does it actually further strengthen your ties to the community and bind you to a place and to a people and to a time, most importantly for whatever this discussion, it is, I think, the only way out, I think. I believe in subsidiarity, and what's the only way out is going to be at the smallest possible scale. Do you have any kind of positive advice you want to give a listener, or kind of vision for like a local or small scale action one can take or actually partake in, that kind of hopes cut back against all this rather upsetting observations Han makes, because unfortunately they all seem to be true?
Yeah, I think there is. Personally, I would say that there is a, a very much a lot of value in preserving the past, but don't not in preserving the past as in museums, right?
Mm.
Not that museums are not important, but that you preserve the past in a manner in which it continues to be meaningful to you. Uh, one example I could say is in my personal life. My grandpa was in the military, right? The
Mm.
Brazilian military. So we still have his civic saber here in my home. So whenever I look at it, I know it is from my grandpa's, and there is something to be said about heirlooms, right?
Mhm.
In which they keep the memory of the person fresh in your mind, but not in the same way as a museum piece will do. I mean, the museum is important to keep the memory of your country uh, alive in you, or of distant empires or whatnot, or whatever your local museum has. But when things are more closer to you, they do uh, uh, emanate a more real presence to you in a sense. And
Mhm.
Han talks about this in the book. The more things are related to you, the more you are related to something, the more meaning it has to you. We have to move away from this notion that meaning is just something that exists in a void. It exists through relationships. And one, I guess I would say a good way for you to flee or to escape to escape from non-time is to create relationships with something and something in time. So whenever you try to create true memories, you're not going to succeed if you don't create a true relationship to something. And I'm not saying this in a vague modernistic sense in which everything's a relationship or whatnot. A relationship is what you make of it. It's not going to happen unless you make of it. So it is an act of active participation. If you're going to honor the memory of something or someone, you have to actively participate on it and be worthy of such a thing. So we're not going to kid ourselves that this doesn't require sacrifice and commitment and ultimately complete orientation towards a goal. So there is the sense in which the modern human can surpass this condition, but it is not going to be easy. But hey, that's why we have the help of God, because without it we will not be able to do anything.
Amen. Amen. Well, was that we covered the first 3 chapters? I believe this is like an 8 or 9 chapter book, so we'll probably do either 2 or 3. One more part, either 2 more parts to wrap up this book. Our listeners, I know the 5-hour streams can be a bit much, and so we're going to try to do going forward, kind of just cut them down a bit, make them much more focused on the first part, breaking up the Han books into multiple episodes and focusing on different chapters rather than just like I know when we did in Cato and Agony of Eros, we didn't mean to, but we kind of skipped like almost a whole chapter because there's just so much to talk about. We ended up accidentally skipping a whole chapter of commentary. And so I want to make sure we actually get in depth on each point he's making because his books are just too dense and rich to accidentally breeze over something, But with that, Gutsavo, any plugs you want to give to the audience?
Especially want to plug our podcast called Araucanian Resistance. We're going to have an episode with Caleb soon, so I hope we see you all there.
Fantastic. Well, everyone, as always, thanks for listening. Have a good night and God bless.